In any life, we have highs and lows, light and dark, wins and losses. What happens when we encounter that moment in time when what happens next could change everything? Join us as we step into another person's inspirational moment and see how we can connect their experience to ours. This is Greg Stevens, and you're listening to A Shot of Inspiration. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of A Shot of Inspiration. I'm Greg Stevens, your host, and today we have an old friend of mine and also a master trainer with Crucial Learning, Beth Wolfson. And Beth, I love Beth because she designs different training programs, but she is an amazing teacher. We have very different teaching styles, and that's one of the things I love with any master trainer. You get their unique training style. So I'm excited to have Beth with us, and she lives in Colorado and she owns a bookstore. And I'll let her tell a little about herself. Then we're going to jump into her life around how she broke through many negative messages in her life as she was growing up and how she had breakthrough after beginning to show up and face them head on. Beth, thank you for being a part of the show.
Thanks, Greg. And I don't want to argue with you. When you started off saying an old friend, I took a little bit of offense. We've been friends a long, long time, but I
Good.
think that we have to be careful. But anyway, there's probably some truth to what you said.
That's good.
Greg, it's a pleasure to be with you. I've had a chance to get to know Greg, and it is fun that, and you may even notice it on this podcast, how we have different paces and different styles, but that makes it really fun and it makes for a wonderful experience together.
Yeah.
So I think you asked me to share a little bit about myself. And in a nutshell, I'll say I probably had 3 careers. My first career, I worked in hospitals in leadership and management. My second career, I worked for I would call it a boutique training, a consulting company in Denver, Colorado. And then since January 1st, 2011, I've had my own business. And as Greg mentioned, I do a lot of the training for Crucial Learning. I also have a lot of clients that I do work with around the area of conflict resolution. I don't shy away. If someone comes to me and says, our team just can't work together, I love to sit back and say, I'd love to show you how. So I think that when people believe they can't work together, there's stress, there's tension, and it wears us down. So I like to do that kind of work. Greg mentioned that I also have designed some training programs. We may or may not talk about some of those today as part of our conversation. And then 3 years ago during COVID, I bought a small bookstore. So that's been a new dimension to my life. So I guess one of the things I would say, and I hope it comes across as we talk today, is when we open up and we get over some of our fears, our hesitancies, our stories, then we can have a much fuller life. Not that I'm not saying it's easy, but it's so possible and doable.
Yeah, very true. And real quick before we jump into that, where is your bookstore located? Because I want to make sure if anyone's in the area, they stop by and buy a book and say hello.
I have to laugh on 2 accounts. So one is I live in a small town called Castle Rock, Colorado, maybe about 30 minutes south of Denver. And the reason I'm really laughing is that even though I'm a bookstore, I sell probably books are the smallest things or the least things that I sell in terms of that. But I would say many book related kinds of things. It's called the Book Nook, and it's at the Barn Antiques and Specialty Shops in Castle Rock, Colorado.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I want to jump to what we came here to really talk about. And many times our listeners will be able to relate with some of this. I think many times people are given negative messages whether it's from family members, whether it's a teacher somewhere, maybe even a neighbor along the way. And sometimes those negative messages can limit us. And I'd just like for you to share some of the negative messages that were posed to you as a child that you took on, but also the ones you had breakthroughs around, because I think it's important that we give people hope and inspiration around we don't have to have life show up the way it was given to us. We can
Yeah.
actually go out and create something different.
Yeah. That's a nice way of starting this, Greg. And probably one of the most important messages that I want to share is that I'm not judgmental or critical of my parents. I believe my parents had what they had and did the best they could with that. As a parent myself, my children may look back and be on a podcast someday talking about me. So I think that what goes around may come around. But I think that as a child, my mother was not a very emotionally expressive person. I think she had a very hard time expressing love to her children. I know she loved us in her own way, but it was hard to be very expressive. I was just talking to my son the other day and I said, Zach, do you remember me playing with you? And he goes, yeah, sure. But as I look back, I can't remember my mother ever playing with me or even reading a book. So that's just some of the memories that I have. And my mother had, now she had some issues growing up. So as a parent, she took care of us. She was a very good caretaker, but she also didn't know how to connect to us emotionally. And so there's three sisters in the family, and I'm the middle one. And my mother early on gave us each kind of a label. In other words, this is how I see you, this is how you are, and this is how I'm going to interact with you. And my label was not a pretty one. My label is that I'm a bad child, I'm a mean child, I'm selfish, I'm really unworthy of love. And those are the messages that I received. My sisters also got their boxes, but I don't need to talk about those. And so while I had a great childhood, there'd be just times that I would just be perceived and interacted with through that particular lens.
Right. And when you said that, it's interesting because it brought up for me, my mom was very emotional, supportive later in life, but early on, she never could relate with children. She typically said she didn't like children, but when we got to
Mm.
junior high, that whole piece changed.
Yeah.
I would rather have it change later in life, but
Yeah.
my mom just didn't like kids as much. I don't think my mom left me with as many of the negative things when you're talking about not being playing with. That's the only thing I could remember with dad. I only remember playing with him once, and he
Yeah.
would play basketball with me, and I wouldn't score a point. He said, "You won't get a point until you earn it." And then by the time I was in 8th grade, I could beat him outright. So, kind of a motivation there
Yeah.
at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
But, again, everyone has a little different story. So, what did that do with you having that feeling like you were the bad kid?
Yeah.
How did that show up in your life later, and how did you get through that?
Yeah, I'll talk about that, but just to illustrate maybe an example of what it looked like as a child, I remember one Christmas in particular. I was probably 9 or 10ish. I can't remember the exact age. And we're sitting on the Christmas tree, opening our presents, my two sisters and I, and my parents. And we had a cousin who was very talented. She used to make homemade gifts for us. And so we always were very excited to see what gifts she would make. And so this particular Christmas, we were opening up our presents, and my older sister went first. And as she was opening it up, I turned to look at it. And it was this adorable petunia pink kind of banner. So she had made banners out of burlap. And on the banner, she had made some felt images and some words. So there was a little image of a girl and then a little poem she had written on the banner. And so my sister had this petunia pink banner, a sweet little girl, and a sweet little saying. So then I turned to my younger sister, and she had this really nice yellow, almost a canary yellow kind of banner. Again, a sweet little girl and also a sweet little poem. Then I opened mine, and I was almost in shock because it was green, but not a pretty green. It was almost what I would call camouflage green in that kind of color palette. And there was a small girl holding a balloon with a huge frown on her face. And this was the poem, and I remember it 50 years later. It was, Dear God in heaven, how loving thou must be to leave thy home in heaven and love an erring child like me. And I was like confused. So I turned to my mom and I go, what does erring mean? And she said, bad, evil, wrong. And then she said, see, Beth, everybody knows you're this way. And
Wow.
so that might be how certain things would kind of show up. The real kicker in all of this is my mother was a very controlling mother. And so she actually had me keep that banner on my wall until I left home to go to college. So that was just a reminder that I saw every single day.
Wow. Well,
Yeah.
how did you get past that into who you are today? Because I don't see you as anything near that. I see you as someone who's vibrant, who is committed to help people, that goes out of your way to make sure people progress in life. And I see you love and support. How did that happen out of that?
Mm. Yeah. Well, I think a couple of things. One is, as you said in the early part of of our podcast, our personality is then created from that. So as I grew into adulthood and into my mid 30s, I had that vision of myself. And so I tended to present myself in a certain way. I guess what I would say is I didn't present my authentic self. And so because I wasn't sure how to act to be accepted, I would tend to do what other people did, copy what they did. I would not really want to take a lot of risks or be judged harshly because that was something that just felt bad. And so, in a sense, I think I lived with a lot of anxiety. And I share this because we can all read the articles and the news and the research. A lot of us live in stress and anxiety. And I think the nice thing is we don't have to. And my journey out of that happened again in my mid 30s. And I have to give my husband, Steve, all the credit for this and the majority of credit for this. And he would see my self image, my bad self image show up in different ways. And then one day he was sick of my little pity party. And he said to me, Beth, I don't get it. I think you're the most loving, kind, giving, supportive person I know. I don't get it. And then he said to me, what are you so afraid of? Why are you so unwilling to give that image up? And that just shocked me when he said, what are you so afraid of? And I thought, what am I afraid of? And it was really finding out who I was, taking risks and showing up differently. Probably the biggest thing was really asking for help because I had to ask a lot of adults in my life. And again, in my 30s, and they might be older than me, but like, how do you do this? Like, how do you connect with people this way? And can you help me? Can you coach me? And so I guess I would say it's that vulnerability, that willingness to make mistakes, that sense of forgiving ourselves. And so that was the mental process.
Yeah.
I also was fortunate enough that at the same time I was introduced to a book. Many of you may have heard of it. It's by Dr. Susan Jeffers called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And when I read that book, my whole world just opened up
Mm.
because she makes many key points about we're all fearful of certain kinds of things, whether they're physical things, whether they're the unknown. A lot of the fears are emotional fears like rejection, lack of approval, not being successful. So we all face that. I hope I'm not overgeneralizing too much when I say we all or everyone, but most of us do face these kind of fears throughout our lives. And her principle is you're going to sit in those fears and you're going to have the same kind of life unless you choose to act and do something. So that's why I like to feel the fear. Yes, okay, I'll feel the fear, but then basically do something anyway, work your way through it. And so that was really the beginning for me.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that book. I read that when it first came out. I love the title, and I thought this would be a good one to actually get past many fears, and I loved it just because when you mentioned it, I don't know if I've met anyone else who's brought that up, but I remember getting it. I remember
Yeah.
sharing it. I was in sales at the time and I was having an issue with walking up and asking for the order. I'd done many other things, but it was like, I think even in sales, after a while, you get battled and bruised. You're like, I don't want to. But I also
Yeah.
understand also fear always distorts what reality.
Mhm.
And when we buy into that fear, we can't move much
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
that locks us in. So
Mhm.
as you face those fears, was it just books you read? Did you take any classes? Did you go through any type of therapy? What did you do to get not just read the book, but how did you apply it or what were there other things you did?
Well, this is why I like the book because it's not about reading a book. It's about reading a book and then doing something about it.
Right.
So I think that sometimes just reading books, you can see book you and I have tons of books on our bookshelves. Those are great unless you do something
Right.
with it. And so I really began to take risks. And probably one of the most significant risks around this time was a career change. And many of us want to do something different. We may be interested in other careers but we have this fear that hold us back, and the fears can be very different. Would I be accepted? Could I even do that? Do I have the qualifications? Will I be rejected if I try to get another job? Will I be good at it? So we have all of these fears. And so at this particular time in my life, I was working in a large organization. And because of a lot of the changes that we were going through, people that were my peers were getting a lot of opportunities to do new and different things. Well, I thought that sounds pretty exciting. So I went to my manager and I said, there's a lot of, I've been doing this for 20 years and I'm wondering what else I could possibly do and shared some interest. And as I listened, when I heard her response, I was almost dumbstruck. We talk about this emotional rejection. She said, Beth, I don't really see you doing anything else. And it just polarized me in terms of what, and I'm not a highly emotional person, especially in a work environment. It may be one of the few times that I actually kind of got teary eyed, maybe cried a little bit because someone is saying to me, as good as you've been, and as much as you've committed to our organization, you're not worth investing in. you're not worth keeping and developing. And so at the end of that conversation, I said, can I just go home and think about this and we'll come back and talk about it later? And I came home and told my husband, he is just full of words of wisdom. And this is what he said to me. I told him when I asked the question, he said, Beth, were you really that surprised? Didn't you already know that was the answer? And that's true. I knew that for probably 5 or 6 years, but I was afraid to do something about it.
Mm.
And so then I finally got the courage to ask. It was a rejection in my mind. Yet it was really probably the linchpin for being able to move forward. So we got together the next Monday and talked about it. And we came to a lovely agreement. The agreement was that I would have 6 months to find a new job. I could interview on the job. I could use the time to do that. And she would find my replacement and I would help train that person. So it couldn't have been better.
Right.
And then one of the things she also said is she goes, Beth, all the stuff you're interested in, like communication and people and talking. She goes, I have a friend of mine that owns a business and I think she's looking to hire someone. So she gave me this friend's name. And this is the person that had the license for Crucial Conversations. So that's how I got introduced to my next career of Crucial Conversations. And the position that was open was sales. And I don't think I'd sold anything since I'd sold Girl Scout cookies in high school. And I think I sold a lot of those because I actually ate most of them. So I didn't have a big track record in sales. But this was my thought going into it. I don't know if I'll like it, but here's the deal. At the end of trying this, I'll have learned something about myself. I'll have met new people and I'll have maybe gained some new skills. So I took the job and that really launched my second career
Mm.
where again, Greg and I connected.
Yeah, great. Now, you mentioned something to me before about an accordion of fear. Is that correct? The different levels of fear by Dr.
Okay.
Jeffers. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Kind of different levels of fears. Again, she
Okay.
talks about 3 levels of fear. And this level one is fears of things that can happen to us or fears that require us to take action. So something that can happen to us is we might lose a job. We might be moved across country with a spouse or for a job. We might go through a divorce. And things that require action are things that we consciously need to do, such as saying, I'm not going to wait till I lose my job. I'm going to actually take action to create a new job and a new career. I've known individuals who have been afraid to go to doctors and dentists their entire life. And they can read every single book on going to the dentist or the doctor. That's not going to change things. They have to actually go to the doctor or dentist and take those steps. So I think that's level one of a fear. The second one, and this is the one that I think many of us can connect to easily, is more the ones that involve the ego. And this is our fear of rejection, our fear of not being good enough, our fear of disapproval, our fear of just being criticized or judged in some kind of way. And if each of us look at this, we can probably pinpoint times in our past life, in our day to day experiences. I had one of these just the other day where I felt like I was disapproved of. And so again, they come up, but they no longer hold me hostage in terms of keeping me polarized and immobile.
Right.
The
Right.
last fear and level three, and Dr. Jeffers talks about this is sometimes the hardest one to get over, is the fear that is our belief that we wouldn't be able to handle what comes our way. And this oftentimes could be some kind of catastrophe. Think about all the natural disasters we've had in terms of floods and fires. Think about wars that people have where they lose everything. Our fear or belief that we couldn't handle it. And so, again, it could be a loss of someone in our lives. It could be a significant illness or some kind of medical condition. So, these are the 3 levels. And if anyone is watching this takes a moment, just think about what might fit into those categories for you and what having these fears, what it prevents you from doing or how it impacts your life.
Yeah. I just finished one of my mastermind classes before we got on today, and we were talking about worry. And it's so interesting because as we started getting into worry, it doesn't help you one bit. It just drains your energy. And
Mhm.
most of our worries are never manifested.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if they are, has worrying about them prepared us for them at all? It
Yeah.
hasn't. There's no
Yeah.
preparation.
Yeah.
So it'd be
Yeah.
better if you just let that go. But
Yeah.
we connect to those worries,
Yeah.
we connect to
Yeah.
those fears as if they're real.
Yeah.
And it just zaps us of our energy.
Yeah.
We
We
forget
talk
to
about that in crucial conversations in terms of the stories that we tell. So worry is a strong emotion, and we create it by, I oftentimes say, by catastrophizing our life and what might be ahead of us. You may have a meeting with a manager, your boss, a customer, a client, and before the meeting, we make it about as horrific as it can possibly be. So we put ourselves into an emotional state where we're not going to be at our best, rather than basically putting ourselves in an emotional state of really showing up that would probably yield better results in terms of talking with a manager, talking with the customer, with a child, a parent, a neighbor. Yeah.
Right. What were some of the inspirational moments for you that really helped you address some of the barriers you had, getting over those negative little tapes you had, those fears? What were some of those breakthrough moments that you could share with us?
Yeah. I guess I'd say, I don't know if I'd say breakthrough moments. I guess what I'd say is the sole realization that my life is going to stay exactly the same if I don't take some kind of action, if I don't try something new.
Yeah.
So I would say that one realization really created a flowing of all kinds of opportunities that I looked at differently.
Yeah.
And so they can range from, you mentioned buying a bookstore. I didn't share this part, but when COVID hit, Greg and I were both in the same situation. I often say that on March 31st of 2020, I had about 60% of my work life scheduled out. And one day later on April 1st, I had zero. So I think that many of you might relate to that if you have an independent position or if your job depended on traveling and being in front of people. And so I went to a Pilates class during that time within a couple of days, and I was on the reformer, kind of, I wouldn't say complaining, but musing out loud, saying, I need some work. I'll do anything. If someone needs me to sweep their floors, clean their toilets, I'll do anything. I need some work. And a lady next to me who I knew a little bit, she said, Hey, you want to buy my bookstore? I went, wow. And so I said, can you stay after class? So after class, I said, I have three questions. One is, are you serious? And she goes, yes. The second is, can you give me a price range of what you're looking at? That seemed good. And then I said, does it make any money? So each of those answers sounded good. I knew Kathy and I also knew her bookstore. So we met the next day at 10 o'clock. By 11 o'clock, I gave her a check and bought the bookstore. And at noon, I called my husband and said, Hey, Steve, I bought a bookstore. So that's an example. And I looked at that saying, what's the worst thing that could happen? I lose some money, but in the process, what do I learn? So it's those kind of little things that show up in your life that sometimes we contemplate on too much. I think, Greg, you had a speaker I saw on one of your podcasts talk about we overthink things. And so we analyze, and sometimes we lose these opportunities. And that has been one of the best things that's happened in my life in the last couple of years during COVID, because I've met new people. I've learned a skill that I had knew nothing about, which is retail, and I learned merchandising. And it's been a nice addition to my life. And it worked out where it doesn't conflict with my professional life at all in terms of that. That's an example of just, I don't want to sound cliche, but seize the moment. So when someone says something, before your mind kicks into the stories that Greg and I talk about, it could never work. What do I know about owning a bookstore? What if I lose my money? That gets in our way. That creates the worry, and it gets in our way of being able to jump in and take opportunities.
Yeah, it does, and you didn't have the paralysis of
No.
analysis when you did that, and it was funny because we were just talking about this in my mastermind as well, because once you make that decision, all of a sudden you're just dealing with whatever obstacles come
Yeah.
up in that time.
Yeah.
There's no crosstalk, there's no
Yeah.
worry. This is where we're gonna go, and then you have to begin problem solving. It's where I got into when I decided to go to Baylor, and my mom told me, she said, "East Texas Baptist is a reality because it's cheap and it's close to where we live
Mm.
now." And she goes, "Baylor's a dream." And in that moment, my mom thought she was helping me. She was,
Yeah.
but not in the way she thought. Because what I realized was, what's life if you can't live out some dreams?
Yeah.
And in
Yeah.
that moment, I made the decision. I didn't have the money, but everything showed up as I went through. And it sounds like that's what happened with the bookstore. But I'm really surprised you made that decision so quickly. I think that's the fastest decision on buying a retail place I've ever seen.
And I guess it was got kind of bored during COVID. It could also factor that piece in. But Greg, when you talk about feel the fear, your mother planted fears in you in terms of you can't do that if you don't have the money, but you did it anyway. And I
Yeah,
think that's the whole point. We all have those.
yeah,
And as I just look at my last 20 years of my life, I just see that it was all about taking action and not being risky. Although some people might call buying a bookstore risky, but not being thoughtless and not being too risky, but just examining what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? There's a question that Susan Jeffers uses in her book, and that is, if you knew you could handle anything that came your way, what would you have to fear? And that leads to, and what kind of life could you create if you knew you could handle anything? And that's that level 3 fear of, what if I can't handle this? I've shared some fun examples like a bookstore, and I've shared an example of changing a career, which many of us have done, want to do, should have done, and those kind of
You're
things.
right.
I also faced something that was more of a level 3 fear, which was I got a diagnosis 15 years ago. And so 15 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. And I think it's okay to talk about this, but it's breast cancer. And I felt comfortable because I'd worked in hospitals, I knew the physicians. But when I went to my doctors to talk about my plan of action, there's a range of what you can do. So you can do what I would call maybe more mild kind of treatment, or you can be more aggressive. And the most aggressive thing you can possibly do is bilateral mastectomy with chemotherapy. And I knew that I wanted to do that because I didn't want to worry about anything ever again. But here was my fear, and I want to explain it in a respectful way. I had never experienced, and for anyone who's gone through this, please do not take this word the wrong way. I had never experienced what I might call disfigurement. And I knew that I was going to be disfigured in some way. And in my mind, talking about exaggerating things, I had it look so horrific in my mind that when my doctor said, Beth, let me just show you some pictures, I even said to me, I'm not looking at pictures. And in fact, once we do this, I'm never going to look at myself again. And he was like stunned. And he pretty much said, Beth, I'm not doing this procedure until you can at least look at a picture. So that was the first step. And it sounds silly, but it just made me squirmy to think about it. And so that orientation of going through that and looking at the pictures, which were beautiful. They were absolutely beautiful. We make things out to be so much worse. And going through that experience, it was a very healthy experience. One of the choices that I made is my children were in their early teens, and I wanted to role model for my children. How do you show up when you get some bad news? And so I really feel like the way that I demonstrated showing up for this and explaining things and having them experience it with me, I feel like it's one of the greatest bonding moments with my children looking back.
That's amazing. That really is. You said something earlier when you and I'm so glad you made it through and it's been 15 years
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I just that gives hope to people.
Yeah,
I've been thinking about this since you said something. You don't know how life's gonna look what it's gonna look like
mhm,
until you take some chance, feel that
yeah.
fear, step out. Does your life look anything like you thought it would?
It is so much better. It's so much better because I'm really not living with that anxiety. And again, when you have worry, you have anxiety. Some of these emotions go hand in hand, and it's draining. It's draining to wake up every single day with this pit in your stomach or your heart racing and figure out how to get through the day.
Yeah.
And so that draining doesn't allow you to have space and energy for other kinds of things. So what I love about my life now is I would say I live a very spontaneous life. I try things. I took comic improv. And my thought going into this is, I don't know if I can do this, but here's the deal. I'll find out if I can stand in front of a group, be pretty crappy, fail miserably, and still be alive. And I'm here to tell you, absolutely. So I'm still living. And the spinoff of that is that my daughter really got excited about improv, and she's built her whole adult life around it. She does improv shows in Chicago, in New York as a hobby, not as a paid job. And when she even moved to Istanbul, she tried to introduce improv groups to Istanbul. You just don't know where things go. And again, I'm not someone who can stand up and do improv. I do know that you can come across not so great and walk off the stage alive. And so those are important things to learn. So I think it's the spontaneity. I remember once I signed up, I must not have read the small print, but I had wanted to write a book. So I signed up for this workshop on writing a book. And it was up at this Buddhist retreat, monastery retreat up in Colorado. And when I got there, I realized that, oh my gosh, I'd signed up for a poetry writing class. And as I looked in the little circle around me, there are all these poets. They had published poets, they were experienced poets, they were beautiful with their language. And I had to begin to write poems and share them. And again, when they read their poems, there was accolades, they were lovely poems. When I read mine, a moderate, okay, thanks for trying, sounds good. And what I learned from that, so one is I wrote a lovely poem called An Ode to a Tree Stump, if you're ever interested. But the second thing is I learned the power of journaling and just writing things down. And also, again, so what if I wasn't the poet in the room that got the most accolades or any accolades? I'm here to say I lived through it and it's a fun experience to talk about. So I guess it's just the experiences that I have that just make life fun.
That's great. Yeah, as you were talking about this, you're talking about your kids, and one of the things I've found about kids, they really don't listen to what you tell them, they listen to what you do.
Yeah,
And I think
me.
you've been that example, and it sounds like your kids are following that example.
I think
Would
that
that
has
be a
given them kickstarts. I don't think in any way that they live a life like I live at all,
go
but
ahead.
it's given them kickstarts and it's given them different paths. And I think that's what a parent really wants to do. I know that our parents oftentimes like to mold us to be like they'd like us to be.
Yeah,
Maybe your mother had a little bit of that going on inside her. I know your father did. And just to be able to break that mold and get out of it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I've gotta ask, Oda's tree stump. What do you have it memorized? Can you share it with us?
No, but I have to find it. It's written down. And I think I have an ode to a tree stump 1 and 2. And this came from an activity we had to do. We had to go outside and find an object. We had to stare at it and examine it for over an hour, every nook and cranny and parts and pieces, write down observations, and then come back and write a poem about it. My daughter's a great writer. She actually writes poetry. And I did send her that one, and she thought she would give me a B plus on it. So, Greg, I will find Ode to a Tree Stump, part one and part two, and I will send it to you
That's
just to kind
great.
of close the gap.
We'll publish it with this episode probably.
I don't think so. Let me go back
But
and read it again before we do that.
when you said that, it's interesting because I've heard kind of an exercise like that. What was it like even for that hour looking at that tree stump? I've heard people say you look at it and then you start to see things you never saw, then
Yeah.
you see
Yeah.
things, then you see things. What was that like?
Well, a couple of things. One is, again, I'm kind of a high energy person. I'm probably called it a type A personality type. So I'm like, what a whole hour looking at this thing? But I got into it, even to the point of putting my face on the ground, looking to see what's coming in out of it, seeing the little dust particles, seeing the ants moving around in it, seeing the different shapes in it. So I gave it my all in terms of really getting in touch with this tree stump. If you generally said to me, Beth, go look at an object for an hour, I'd say, do I have to? And that's that resistance that we have.
Mm.
But just try it. What's the old cereal commercial that again, our younger generation might not relate to, but try it, you'll like it
Right,
kind of
Mikey,
thing.
get my let's
Yeah,
get
Mikey.
Mikey. Try
Yeah,
it or
try it, you'll
like it.
like it. And so I guess we just don't know. And I'm gonna be honest, you can try things and not like it.
Yeah,
But that in itself is a lesson.
yeah, absolutely,
I signed up for a class. I'm one that just jumps in. I think you're seeing the theme of me. But I signed up for this art class and it was called Learning to Draw for Non-Artists. So I basically thought, oh, this will be just up my speed. I'll take a little art class. When I was at the class, my husband warned my children. He goes, now, when your mother comes home and shows you her pictures, don't criticize it. Just be nice to her. And so after that horrible experience, it was just very hard and tedious for me. I came home and said, "You look at this crap. This is what I spent 8 hours doing." And again, so you find some things that don't for you.
yeah.
But the thing I did take away from that was we teach crucial conversations and we tell people, hey, try these skills. You can learn them, you can apply them. They're easy. And it's not easy for everybody.
No.
So you get us, it normalized my looking at things and saying, sometimes things aren't as easy for people. And sometimes it's harder to grasp the concepts that we teach
Yeah.
people. So that was probably the takeaway lesson from there.
Yeah.
I did burn that art, Greg. I will not show you that picture at all.
It won't come out with a poem, right?
But a funny follow-up story is probably 8 or 9 years ago, I was meeting my new soon-to-be daughter-in-law, and we were at this little camp place, and they offered classes, and there was this oil painting class or pastel class, I can't remember. And I said, "Hey, let's sign up and do this." And so as we get into the class, my daughter-in-law turns to me and says, "I was a fine arts major in college." And so I'm going, "Okay, this is gonna be exciting too." And I do a picture that was presentable. I think I even shared it with some people. And sometimes we fear not being the best or not being good at something new that we start. And so I'm next to a fine arts major, beautiful picture that she drew. And mine was very interesting and I like it.
That's great. That's great. As we finish up today, Beth, is there any final message you would like to give our audience around how to break through something or an inspirational moment that you would like to leave the audience with? One final, or maybe one final thought of insight or information
Yeah.
that you would like them to have.
Something I'd like to be clear about is that my husband sometimes, when I share my example, he reminds me that not everyone can do this as easily as you can, Beth. So I don't want to come across as though have some superpower to just jump into things and try things. We all struggle with different things, and it's taking baby steps. So if something monumental out there, such as changing a career, maybe leaving or exiting a marriage or a friendship, maybe moving to a different location, that if that seems too overwhelming, start with some smaller things because that just kind of rewires our thinking to be able to see possibilities. So I don't want to come across as though I'm so magical at this. I've shared some of my successes. I've also shared some of my non-successes. The other thing is to realize that we all experience these kinds of things. And sometimes the fear, you said this about worry, Greg, the fear that we carry around with us, the negative stories, the catastrophizing of things, it is so much more painful than the reality. It's the reality is just not typically as bad as we make it out to be. And so it'd be try little things, find something that would stretch you a little bit, maybe not an improv class. My husband won't go near that, go near that. But try maybe a class you want to take that is something you don't know anything about.
Yeah.
Sign up for some of the meetups that we have out there. You meet new people. Just sign up for a meetup. There's no pressure. You go. You may find that you have something in common. You may find that it wasn't what you thought and move on. So I just think it's trying little things is that builds our confidence and our way of thinking about things.
Yeah, getting out of that comfort zone and being vulnerable to life in many
Yeah. Yeah.
ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
Beth, thank you so much. It's a pleasure having you on, and we might do some things later that we discuss.
Yeah.
So you may be seeing Beth again pretty soon. We've got an idea for a show together. And Beth, thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for being here with us and listening to A Shot of Inspiration. I'm Greg Stevens, and please like and subscribe if you want. Love to have that out there in the social media world. Love you, folks. Thanks so much. Bye bye.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Beth. Thanks for listening to this episode of A Shot of Inspiration. If you like this or any of our other episodes, make sure you rate it and share it with a friend. This is Greg Stevens, and we look forward to being with you next time. Until then, be bold, be courageous, and respectfully speak your truth.